Hi, and welcome back to our history videos for this term. Before we start, if I do seem tired or start to fall asleep while I'm filming this video, I do apologize. The time is somewhere close to midnight, so we'll see how we go. Today's lesson is about the prime ministers of Australia. We're going to go through just a really quick snapshot of all the prime ministers of Australia, just really quickly. I'll only stop at points where I feel like there's something interesting to tell you about some of the prime ministers. And then after the end of it, you'll do a research project where you'll pick one of the prime ministers of Australia and do some research. I do apologize if this video does look a little bit laggy. I can see that it's looking a little bit lag. I do apologize. I can't fix that. So let's get started. The first Prime Minister of Australia elected to Australia was Sir Edmund Barton. Okay, so Edmund Barton was the first Prime Minister of Australia and served for a couple of years. Now you can see there his political party, it says down the bottom, is a party called the Protectionist Party. Originally at the start of Federation, there were a few parties that we are not necessarily used to seeing, like the Fair Trade Party or the Protectionist Party and a few other United Australia something party, which then eventually become mainly the two main parties of Liberal and Labor Party and National Party. But around this time, there were three main parties. And yes, this was the first Prime Minister. He actually resigned so he could get a job on the High Court. So he stepped down from his job as the Prime Minister and moved to be part of the High Court. This question about who is the first Prime Minister of Australia does come up a lot. Not many people can tell you much about him, but it comes up, just his name comes up a lot. Alfred Deakin. So the only reason that I would know of Alfred Deakin mainly is Deakin University. But you can see he's done quite a few little short stints. It's like he was Prime Minister for three different separate times. Once again, Protectionist Party. So he carried on from Edmund Barton. Chris Watson, have no idea, but you can see he served for a couple of months. So it must have just been a short term because I actually don't know why. George Reid, once again, don't know much about them. The interesting thing here is he was part of the Free Trade Party, so would have been helping to make Australian trade on a global scale. But once again, wasn't Prime Minister of Australia for long. Andrew Fisher, you can see he was Prime Minister of Australia for three different terms, and he was part of the Labor Party. Joseph Cook, once again, can't tell you much about him. Billy Hughes. Okay, so I do know a bit about Billy Hughes, mainly because he's such a well-known figure in Australian history because he was Prime Minister of Australia during the whole of World War One. So a lot of the decisions that were being made about the troops and about things, he was part of that, and the war ending and all of those things. So there's a lot about him in history in Australia because a lot happened while he was Prime Minister, which is quite often what happened is that if you were just around really important parts of history, then you're kind of more well known. So he was the Labor Party, National Labor, Nationalist. Back then, a lot of the parties were just changing names quickly. I haven't really seen the parties change names since I've been alive, but Stanley, Melbourne, Bruce, part of the Nationalist Coalition. Now, what a coalition means is if you need a majority of seats in Parliament to be in power and you don't get that majority. So let's say if it's let's say hypothetically, if you needed 100 seats to be in charge and you only got 90 and the other party got 80, nobody got to 100. So no one can be in charge. So what has to happen is two parties come together and they join up and they say, let's be a team. And we will, and then if we're a team, then we'll have enough votes to get through. So a coalition is basically, we have one at the moment. It's when the Liberal Party and the National Party get together and they're a coalition. So both of those joined together would not ever have enough votes to win, to be in power. But because the National Party and the Liberal Party come together, they become the coalition government. Scullin, don't really know anything about him. Joseph Lyons, he was quite a long Prime Minister of Australia, actually. I mean, you know what? I don't know anything much about him. Well, it would have been quite a lot during the Great Depression, so could be an interesting person to study. Once again, Earl Page, only for maybe 20 days. Looks like he was prime minister for. So really not much there. Who's next? Robert Menzies. He would be probably the most well-known prime minister of Australia in its history, mainly because he was prime minister for about 18 years, but through a long period of time. So if you see there, he first gets in 1939, which means he's in charge when World War II breaks out. And he's in charge of, he's the prime minister of Australia for the first few years of the war. Then he loses power for like 8 years and then gets it back. And then when he wins it back for another like 16 or 17 years. He's the longest serving Australian prime minister, and there'd be a lot of stuff about him out there. And he was the United Australian Party coalition, what we would call the Liberal Party today. Arthur Fadden, don't know anything about him. Only served for a month, so really not much on him. John Curtin, do know a lot about John Curtin. John Curtin was the Prime Minister of Australia during most of World War II. So he's a very, very interesting character. And there's a lot about John Curtin. John Curtin is most famous for when Australia was looking like they were going to get invaded through the top of Kokoda, and they were going to be invaded. John Curtin tried to call his troops home, and he got into a fight with the English Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who didn't want Australians to come home. And he sort of stood up and brought the Australian troops home to try to save Australia. So he's quite well known for that period of time around the big events of World War II in Australia. France, don't know anything about him. But once again, Prime Minister for a week. We have to put him in there, but really didn't do much. Ben Chifley. There's also Chifley University. There's quite a lot of these people have universities named after them. And he was Prime Minister in the post-war. So post-World War II, as World War II finished, he was the Prime Minister for the next 4 or 5 years after that. Harold Holt, very interesting. Harold Holt is probably one of the most interesting Prime Ministers in history. Harold Holt was a Prime Minister for about a year. And then he went for a swim off the coast of Sydney and disappeared, completely disappeared. Nobody knew where he was. Nobody ever found his body. Nobody knew what happened if he drowned. Nobody knew. And imagine the Prime Minister of Australia just disappearing and nobody knows where they are. No one can ever find them. It's such a strange thing. It's very rarely happened in any other country in the world. So he was Prime Minister and he died while he was in office, and someone had to take over from him because he pretty much drowned. John McEwen, Prime Minister for a year or two, don't know much about him. John Gorton, Prime Minister of Australia during the outbreak of the Vietnam War. So there's quite a lot around him and what he was doing around those times. William McMahon, only Prime Minister for a short amount of time. Gough Whitlam. Now, once again, you want to talk about controversial figures in Australian history. Gough Whitlam is a person that people either really liked Gough Whitlam or really disliked Gough Whitlam. But he's most famous for the fact that, besides the fact he was offering free university and a lot of other things, that he was the only Prime Minister of Australia to be kicked out of office by the Governor-General. So the Governor-General was displeased by the way that Gough Whitlam was running the country, talked to the Queen, and got approval to basically remove Gough Whitlam from office. Huge controversy, the most controversial probably moment in Australian democratic, I would say, history, a lot, because very rarely did I tell you that Governor-General never really was actually executing this sort of power. So it was very interesting when this all happened. Very interesting character, Gough Whitlam. If you're going to do one on him, there's a lot that he did that people don't like and a lot that he did that people really, really like, even up until this day. Check it out. Malcolm Fraser, Prime Minister for quite a long time. Just before I was born, don't really remember anything about him. Can't really tell you much at the moment. Bob Hawke, can tell you a lot about Bob Hawke. Very, very much Prime Minister where he was his main selling point was he was like an everyday Australian. You know, he was quite an interesting character. If you look him up, there's a lot of interesting stuff about him. Prime Minister during mostly when I remember growing up. He died just recently in the last, I think it's the last year or so. And then he was part of the Labor Party. Then moved on to Paul Keating, which was 2 long-serving Labor prime ministers in a row. And then after him was John Howard, and John Howard was actually Prime Minister then on for the next 11 or 12 years. There's a lot about John Howard because probably he was most around when I was growing up. One of the interesting things was about his proposal that banned automatic guns and bought all the guns back off people to try to stop any sort of mass shootings happening. That was probably what he's most known for. There's a lot of controversial things either way, once again, that people liked him or disliked him. We're not here to get into that. But yeah, he was Prime Minister for a long time. And then after that, it was Kevin Rudd. You may not know Kevin Rudd. Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister in 2007. There's a big thing that he actually was able to beat John Howard at that point. And he was Prime Minister, and then he got kicked out because his own party kicked him out to then put in Julia Gillard. And then she won it back and she was in power, and then people stopped being happy with her. So her own party kicked her out and put back in Kevin Rudd again. But then Kevin Rudd, that's so confusing. It goes off and on and off and on. And then Kevin Rudd got beaten by Tony Abbott. And then Tony Abbott was in charge, but people weren't, but his party weren't happy with him. So they kicked him out and put Malcolm Turnbull back in. And then Malcolm Turnbull was in and people weren't happy with him. So his own party kicked him out and put Scott Morrison in, which is why Scott Morrison's there today. So you can see the last 10 years or so is just constantly own parties turning on each other and kicking each other out. It's quite interesting as it goes. But what I'd like you to do is pick one of those people that we've talked about, not one of the ones that was in power for like a week. Someone who you think made an impact during their time, research them, find out about them, and then fill out the research task. All right. Thanks for watching.